So welcome, everybody. I'm Mariana Mazzucato. I'm the director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. And this event today is part of our series on innovation in the welfare state, which tries to debunk the myth that kind of wealth creation happens in one part of the economy and then it gets redistributed to, the people. How can we actually redesign our welfare state institutions, but also participation of citizens in society in order to also drive innovation, because we shouldn't forget that innovation has not just a rate, but also a direction. And tonight we're extremely proud to have two world-class figures in this whole area of what does it then mean to think about, again, the rate and direction and ownership of innovation in the data economy. And of course, the data economy today is everywhere. We all are producing data every time you click on something, but also using it in all sorts of different ways. And we really want to do this in terms of putting this concept of value creation and public purpose at the center of the debate. And one way to frame this is that the companies themselves, which we all sometimes know as the FANG companies, so Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, they have obviously benefited massively from different types of public investments, which have been funded by the taxpayer, but also they are every day. And how come is it that we've sort of accepted that this data just gets housed inside the companies and then we worry about problems afterwards, kind of too little too late, whether it's about taxation or privacy. So what we want to do today is really to also rethink the structures, the institutional and social innovations that we might have to redesign the relationship between citizens, the state, the companies that both create certain parts of that system but also benefit massively from that social and public structure. So let me just first introduce our speakers, and then I will provoke them with some questions, and then we absolutely want to open it up to engage you in the debate. So Evgeny Morozov, sitting to my right, is the author of two books, The Net Delusion and To Save Everything. And he has a new book coming out that he writes when he's traveling the world, but actually just discovered he hides in southern Italy, in Calabria, to do most of his writing. He has a monthly column which appears in several international newspapers. He's been a fellow at Georgetown University, Stanford, Open Society Foundation's New America Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin. He has a PhD in History of Science from Harvard University. I also had all these other things I could say about you, like named one of 28, who are the other 27, most influential Europeans by Politico in 2018. I'm sure he's number one.
They were actually Europeans, unlike me, which is in the gray zone of Belarus. But.
Okay. And Isabella de Michelis is here. She's the founder and CEO of Ernie app. My father would like that. His name is Ernie. I'll tell him. The company which launched the first worldwide privacy knowledge manager, a consumer internet app which is forging into a business model of GDPR. GDPR consent rule. And Ernie app is a concrete attempt to bring the RTM, right to monetize theory, into motion after Isabella conceptualized the right for consumers to receive a fair compensation for the contribution they provide to innovation. And she'll be talking a lot about that. Before Ernie app, she worked many years for the private sector, as well as for governments and institutions in her capacity of technology, policy, and regulatory advisor. And what's going to be really interesting, I think, in this discussion is that, part of the framing of this could be, why are the rewards from this data economy being, if you want, captured by a very small number of companies, and what can we do to actually really create and allow the benefits from what should be a dynamic form of modern capitalist wealth creation to the citizens, the wider social group. But another part of that question is, do we even have, as I mentioned before, the institutions to allow that to happen? So do we also need some pretty radical rethinking of our organizations, our laws, and literally the social innovations, which would allow, again, the welfare state to not always catch up to the problems that are presented by some of these companies that are very large and, as we know, also evade quite a bit of tax, but are actually leading the way in terms of forming this new type of citizenship. So let's start, and I'd like to start with a question of what are then the alternatives to big corporations or big states owning the data? What is the data ownership question? I'll start, I think, with Evgeny. Actually, no. It says here, Isabella. I actually had some smart people in the institute tell me what the order should be, and I'm ready to survey. So, Isabella.
All right. So big questions, and I'll try to make it very simple answers.
So what we saw arriving was a kind of momentum where the excessive practices of certain businesses would actually block the data rather than have this flow of data continuing to flourish and continue to animate the innovation that is needed to build the next society. And that may include the welfare state. I'll talk later about that. But really, the first motivation as to why we built this concept of right to monetize was trying to rethink what we can do collectively about something that is working but not that well, but not stopping the data to continue to be produced and processed. Because
Can you explain the right to monetize?
Yeah, I'll get there, and I can show on the. I think it's here, right?
It's here, it's very simple, is the notion that if the data are needed, they should not be blocked. And with privacy, data breaches, antitrust problems with companies, and the competitive playing level field being very verticalized, because there are a few companies who own so many data, there is a disengagement from the user as to why they should understand they are so important to the creation of the value. So you can't have innovation without the data in the data economy, and you can't have a lot of data without the consumers being engaged, and you can't have a lot of data with too much privacy. That's the equation of the innovation today, like it or not. So what can we really change? We can change the way the users perceive their value, and this is what RTM is about. So we're not saying, and we're not advocating, we're not calling for a change in how privacy is implemented or in how the data exchange is implemented. We are trying to bring in the mindset of people a very significant change in how they value the data they produce, because they are suppliers, they are not just consumers. And if they are suppliers, they need to understand that value, but that value is not transparent because there's no transparency in the transaction between a user and a service provider. So the right to monetize, what does it do exactly? It first of all sets a principle of fair compensation for producing data. And it does it in a very non-discriminatory way. Everybody should be entitled to that fair compensation. That compensation should be calculated on a fair market value. That's a dynamic calculation, and technology is there to help that. Technology is just a way to do things. It's not the scope in itself of having innovation. The intent is to have new services for the consumer, new product for the consumer, new wealth for the society, new innovation in how we transform the economy. So if the data are needed, consumer knows it, they get transparency in what the value is, they have a reason for deciding to whom they give the data versus to whom they don't give the data anymore, because you don't need to give it to everybody to create the value. You actually create a kind of artificial scarcity in how you consent to your data sharing, and in this way the consumers gets back the ownership of their data. And there are, of course, I think I'll leave it for later on, how the mechanic works, but the principle is fair, proportionate compensation for everyone as a supplier, with respect to all the stakeholders who are in need of consented data. This is a very legal concept that goes with right to monetize, the concept of consent, because today we live in an environment in Europe where the GDPR was designed to give room for users to express their consent. What happens in reality? People don't know how to express the consent. It's complicated, it's hidden, it's obfuscated, it's difficult, and you don't really know why you should be giving a consent to a usage you don't know of what it is after you've given the consent to the data you've given. So the right to monetize reverse the order of magnitude of the who decides what, because the consent comes back in your hand. You know that your consent is needed for the companies who want to use your data. You get a valuation of that consent through the automation of the technology, and collectively we negotiate, we bargain a better treatment of our privacy on one side, but also on the valuation of the data that we produce for certain companies.
Can you just give us an example of?
I'll give you a very practical example. So, how many people consider Uber a competitor of Google in the room? Does anyone in the room considers? You do. You say that's great. That's great. I would say it's already a very significant percentage. Usually it's a zero, or a company, Amazon, being a competitor to Apple. Okay, a little bit more, right? And this is the point. if it's just 20% of the world thinking that these companies are competing between themselves, there's not really a mechanic that you can trigger to actually rehearse that competition even more. But imagine a situation where essentially those two companies, Uber and Amazon and let's say even Apple, are the three in need of having your geolocation consented. They need the geolocation for advertisement purposes, for personalization of the services, of improvement of the current software release, for a variety of reasons, but they all need the same data. They need your geolocation. Now, if you know that the three of them need it, would you give it to the three like this? Would you give it to two and not to the third? Would you give it for something in exchange or just zero? Or you would not give it to any of the three. Now, if you have the choice, you can decide. The beauty of the system is you have to be able to decide. You have to exercise a right and you have to extort a compensation for you. It's not a nice, elegant way of saying extort, but it's a way to actually bargain. And the beautiful of the game is that you can also say, I'm not giving it to you for other reason than the reason for which you asked me for having it, which is the performance of the service. Not everything else that comes with the application. So we have created, and actually this is triggering me to talk about the solution, because you need to also bring a remedy in the market. You can't just say make a diagnosis. It's crappy, it doesn't work, and we don't have a solution. These companies need the data. The people don't have transparency in how the data are valued. They don't have a visibility on how these companies compete with each other. If they get that level of understanding, that it's very simple. It is very simple. If the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 of these companies want all the same data, then you can trade. And for example, Tesla is a competitor to, who do you think Tesla is a competitor to?
Apple, Google, and all the mass geolocalization data store, the data processor when it comes to geolocalization.
Why
Okay.
are you sitting there? Sit here.
That's a very good answer. With the growing of the world of the connected cars, and the car is there's a representation, a metaphor to talk about the connected car is a computer with 4 wheels. It's exactly what these platforms intend to do. They need to collect the data in the cities. They need to georeference, geofence, integrate, correlate, track and target you with a degree of accuracy that is very, very, very performant. But all these companies are competing, and the people need to know about it.
Okay, so I guess the question that might be buzzing in the room, and I'm going to hand over to Evgeny in a second, is, does this actually sort of upset this problematic pie and how it's been created, or does it just allow you as a consumer to get a piece of it? Do we need, fundamentally different forms of institutions, or is this just a question of, being part of that competition process, allowing the citizen to get their share versus perhaps?
We never heard the word citizen, we heard the word consumer. I would just like to emphasize that the word citizen has not been invoked in what we've heard so far.
Okay.
So you introduced it, but it was introduced by the original speaker. So we should not be confusing those
consumer,
two.
because you're talking about the user with the actual technology. Okay.
Yeah, but the user is a very
Users.
ambiguous category, which in the last 20 years has allowed to blend 2 very separate political identities. On the one hand, that of the citizen, which is a figure with rights, obligations, responsibilities, and so forth, who's engaged primarily in a political forum, and the idea of the consumer, which is a participant in the marketplace, which is there to essentially get things done at the lowest possible price,
Right.
And be happy with it.
So
Right?
what's-
And I think by blending those two into the single figure of the consumer, or the single figure of the user, we're actually making the solution to whatever problem we're trying to solve more difficult.
This isn't just one quick thing before you come to your answer, given that you've
Yes,
opened up this kind of worms.
Sorry, I do
We
those
had
footnotes,
Mike
but
Bracken,
yeah.
We had Mike Bracken here some weeks ago, and he talked about this because he's one of the founders of gov.uk here with Government Digital Services, and what they did was in the first day on the jobs, they basically said, the citizen is not a customer or a client, but a user, and that has to fundamentally change how we even think of designing a public digital platform. Anyway, so yes, so tell us your version of what is then the alternative to the current situation where the companies themselves actually own the data, and then we're just trying to sort of regulate ourselves out of the mess that then's created from that.
Sure. So let me start maybe from the end, because I might get into very hardcore conceptual territory and I would lose half of you. So before I get there, let me just tell you at the outset that I'm not a big fan of the right to monetize as a solution to any of the immediate problems that register on my radar. So we'll probably have a heated discussion about it, or I hope we will. Now, I must say that I've spent the last 10 years bashing quite heavily the tech industry. So I've really spent a decade bashing Facebook, Google, Amazon, and the rest of them. And I think that in that decade, the rest of the world caught up. But instead of celebrating, I feel something of a Pyrrhic victory of sorts, because I think a lot of people are bashing them for reasons that make sense for them, but without necessarily understanding why we need to worry about them. So there are a lot of people bashing them for privacy violations, for antitrust violations, and for a lot of other things. And I think those, to some extent, are valid concerns. But I think that we are missing, to some extent, the big picture. And if we miss the big picture, the causal account we are going to give of what currently hurts us and what currently stands in the way of a more progressive, enlightened policy when it comes to the digital would also not become clear to us. Let me unpack that, as they say. So I think the reason why we should be asking those questions, particularly in relation to the welfare state and its future, is not just because every welfare service has a data aspect, right? That's clearly an important reason to be discussing them. But I think the second and perhaps the most important reason is that many of these firms, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, are rapidly entering parts of the welfare state. They're entering the education sector, they're entering the healthcare sector, they're entering transportation. They basically would like to be in what, until now, has been a public service, right? And the reason why that is happening is not because data can do magic, but because there has been an active effort to dismantle those public services and to essentially hand them over to the firms who can do it faster, cheaper, and perhaps without much concern to whoever has been in charge of that sector and vertical previously. Now, if that's one of the background conditions that we are concerned about, right, then I think we have to be able to articulate a solution that will also help us to reverse that process. And that can be, to some extent, just the normal defense of welfare institutions, which has been done in this country, and somebody like Jeremy Corbyn is still doing it now. Or it can be a more creative effort to reinvent new forms, and perhaps old forms, of providing welfare, education, healthcare, transportation, and so forth. Do it creatively, do it perhaps in a less centralized hierarchical way, involving citizens in decision making, using digital platforms to do that, and to do it in a way that will help us avoid, or perhaps at least slow down, this process of dismantling and takeover of the public sector by private actors. Now, of course, one of the enabling conditions for that process has been pointed out by Mariana and many of the her colleagues and collaborators, which has to do, of course, with financialization of the firm, the way in which we have put short-term gains for proprietors of the firm in front of or ahead of long-term value. All of that is correct. So it has happened, that changed at the level of the firm, but it has also happened at the level of the citizen, right? And this is where it's very important to understand that one of the enabling conditions for this neoliberal takeover has been the emergence of this idea of consumer sovereignty, that essentially consumers should be sovereign, and any political identity that does not default to consumption has to be tamed, tied, and eliminated. So your idea as a member, or your identity as a member of a trade union, your identity as a member of a citizen association, your identity as a member of some local group, all of that essentially has to be tied to your identity as a consumer, and then you can continue participating in your local neighborhood activity, but you will do that because you expect to receive points in return for what you do, and not because you're driven by considerations of solidarity or something else. So even a lot of basic activities of collaboration have been reinserted essentially into financial markets, just like the activities of many firms at the level of the firm have also been reinserted into more or less financial markets. Now, the reason why I make such a long introduction is because I think it's fundamental that we essentially try to find ways in which we can design institutions that do not try to accelerate the rhetoric and the logic of consumer sovereignty, but would actually try to reinvent alternative identities for citizens in which we will talk to them in a language other than the language of the marketplace. In that sense, for me, that's the problem, that we have lost the ability to mobilize people to do things that do not default to the logic of the market. In that sense, I think there are a lot of things we can be doing with data. There are a lot of things we can be doing with infrastructure. We can be designing non-market forms of cooperation and collaboration where people would come and essentially collaborate with each other and would produce new discoveries, innovations. We can call it social innovation. We can call it anything we want. But the idea is that we will not get there if we just focus on one element of that story, which is the ownership of data. Because I don't want us to end up in a world where Google starts running your healthcare system, they start running your education system, they start running your transportation system, but you will be happy because you will receive a cut from the data that you have generated. Right? It's, of course, the nightmarish, maybe overstated scenario. But for me, the political economy of welfare provision is a question that cannot default to the political economy of data ownership. Right? And once you sort of separate the two, I'm not sure I would spend a lot of time on the question of data ownership as separated from the broader political economy of welfare.
Can you give us another, so on June 20th, Francesca Bria, who's sitting here in the audience, will be coming and speaking to us about a specific experiment, or if you want, lab, if you want, that they have in Barcelona, where the idea that you also might need some sort of public repository also to house this data to improve public services. So it's not sort of, citizens, if you want, at war with each other and getting their own share. But can you give us
Sure.
Other examples, because you said, collaborating and innovating together, but in terms of the data, right? I mean, data is being generated. There is technology that allows data to be generated every time you do something. What are the fundamental, if you want, more radical then,
but think about it at the
innovations that
level
you're thinking
of
of?
infrastructure. Sure. If
Yeah.
you think
Yeah.
about it at the level of infrastructure, what I would like to do is to lower the cost of access to collaboration infrastructure and to the ability by means of sensors and other tools of communication for citizens to identify what essentially is not working in their life, in their neighborhood, in their everyday life, in their houses, transportation system, or whatever, and start finding ways, perhaps with some funding, coming from the public sector, public venture fund, whatever you want to call it. Now, we have venture capitalists who funded only on one model, and that model is build an app. Build an app and monetize it by essentially selling that app to Google. I don't want to have that model. I would like to see a world where citizens who identify a certain need, how that need gets identified can be different. You can identify it by way of collecting a lot of data about the particular geographical area and then flagging that a lot of potholes don't get fixed and people will find an ingenious way to fix it. I mean, to me, that part is trivial. What is not trivial is having an organizational and a political process that will lower cost of access to that infrastructure, would ensure that that data that is gathered from that sensory infrastructure is not owned as a commodity by the firms and is not also owned by citizens themselves in a way that would prevent actually massive analysis of that data at scale without paying every single individual for access to it, and then finding ways in which you can actually enhance and accelerate the collaboration of citizens. I'll just say one little footnote and then I will shut up. I mean, you have to understand why, for example, neoliberals insist on markets. It's not because they theoretically why they insist on markets, right? Not pragmatically. Theoretically, the argument is very simple. They want markets because markets promote competition. Why do they want competition? Because competition is the way in which you discover new stuff. I mean, if you go and read Hayek, that's his argument, that essentially competition is a procedure of discovery. It forces firms to innovate, it forces consumers to communicate their new needs, then new needs emerge. I mean, the entire thing revolves around discovering new knowledge, discovering new needs, discovering new tastes, discovering new forms and techniques of production. That's the neoliberal argument, which I think is wrong. It's wrong in that
it's not the only way of discovering new things. There are tons of other ways and procedures in which, if we actually empower citizens with technology, with knowledge, with sufficient funding, we'll discover many more procedures, many more techniques, and many more ways to actually make the world a better place. I have nothing against it, and I think we should be encouraging people to come forward and unearth and discover those things by mechanisms other than the market. It's not because I do not believe in the market. In certain circumstances, it clearly works. But there are tons of other circumstances where other forms of social coordination would work better. And I think that the task of a progressive project and of the new reinvented welfare state should be finding a way to essentially rediscover or discover those ways of collaboration and discovery, and not play on the neoliberal playground where we would be always saying that, well, the market is the way to generate knowledge, everything else is something else. Or the only alternative to the market then is the state, and everything else is kind of peripheral civil society, which is good for maybe raising money during a hurricane, but is not good for anything else. I think we need to go beyond that idea.
Let me bring in Isabella, and then I'll provoke you.
I think I would like to make a couple of points on, it seems we're very distant, but we may be less distant than it looks. Right to Monetize has a particular specific idea that is wake up the people. You talked about mobilizing people. The reality is that we are in the hand of the automation technology, where we bring the level of knowledge of people below zero. Because the user experience is about not making it difficult for people. Because we don't want them to think. Because we don't want them to reason. Because the simplest it is, the easier it's going for an app to be downloaded by 2 billion people. The problem is that once they are locked into an app that it's used by 2.5 billion people in the world, they don't go into another one. And those apps are not interoperable. There are no standards for interoperability. You can terminate your mobile call on a fixed line, you can call on a satellite, you can access the internet on the Wi-Fi, on the 3G. We've got lots of standards on electrical plugs and stuff like that. There's nothing on the internet. And guess why? Because once you're locked in your vertical app, you're stuck there forever. And the fact that the knowledge of the people is so little about what happens behind the touch and the click, it's what is making the governments of this world totally liable and responsible for having created the situation where we are. Is because the politicians know even less than the citizens. And that's why we call on the users. We want them to be waken up. We called our app, unfortunately, we didn't have any other choice than having an app. Privacy Knowledge Manager. Why it's their knowledge? Because in the app there is a game. And what does the game? The game creates through a routing planner and through a series of quizzes the level of the knowledge of the gamer, of the player, to go up in understanding how the internet functions. What is the network layer? What is the application layer? What are the different protocols that are used by companies? What are the business models? Who is a competitor to whom? How does it happen that certain things that no one knew before, actually everybody in the industry knew how exactly Facebook was exchanging the data with their third-party partners? Everybody knew in the industry how it's working, the government included. The social welfare state? Are we talking about social welfare state in a country that was capable to sell the Chelsea hospital data to Google just because it got promised back to digitize those data that it didn't have the money to do it? This is the reality. This is what we're talking about today. So if we want to have a different model, and we cannot rely on people and on the consciousness of people and on the knowledge of people, we can forget about having this changed. So how you motivate the people? Based on the marketing analysis of the world and the studies and the PhDs of lots of students in the world, there are no zillions of ways of doing it. You have two ways. You have to create incentives. And the incentives needs to speak at least to half of the population of the world to create effect. And half of the world goes after the money, and half of the world goes after the rights. So if you touch it to these 2 points, you at least touch at enough population in the world to try to wake up enough people to start thinking differently. You have to give the right to choose. That's why we called it a right. It's not an app, it's right to monetize. It's your right, it's not an obligation. You can apply, you cannot. And what does it really bring? It brings an element of cost in the structure of the cost of these companies that today they're not paying. Because the reality is that digital industry is the industry that is paying the less the supply of the data, because it doesn't need to pay the data. And every other industry is paying that cost, and that cost is passed on the consumer, and then you have theories and theories and theories in whether it's good or bad. But if every other industry in the world does it, why that digital industry doesn't do it? And what we thought that it could really work well is that with the right to monetize, you create an incentive for the user to apply their own policy on whom they want to trust and on whom they want to get rewarded and from whom they don't want to be rewarded, and they will stay in peace with just a simple maybe service that is not creating 15 different variations of the service, like you have 15 different variations of serving an ad, which I find particularly useless, but apparently the people are happy with that. But that cost, imagine what it means. That cost passed back from the companies back to the user as an income. It's the perfect way to fund our social welfare state from the other side. We don't ask the companies to pay the taxes because they don't pay the taxes, because there's no way to know how much they should pay, because we don't know how much they make on a per country basis, because we don't know how much
But that problem could be fixed.
That
So,
problem could be
Isabella,
fixed if the citizens,
Yeah.
not the users, if the citizens would play in the country where they live with the government in that direction.
So could one, I mean, what would you say to, well, to me in this case, because I'm saying it, but anyway, to the point that in some ways you're focused more, if you want, on the short-term solutions, which is given this very problematic situation, we should at least allow citizens to realize how their data is being used. And to, yeah, but then would you agree that at least in the medium term and the long term, what this actually requires is fundamentally different types of relationships, new forms of collaborations, new ways in which citizens are interacting with, if you want, platform capitalism.
So the relationship is really, I mean, the way we see the relationship is between the
like
government,
Sorry, because you talked about waking up. Is this simply the wake-up call, or is this really the solution?
No. It's the wake-up call is the first part. It's going to take maybe 4 or 5 years, and within this 4 or 5 years, you introduce regulation that you really need to bring into the
regulation
platforms.
question, because this is the sort of second of 3 areas that we wanted to talk about. So, with regulation as well, one could start looking at short-term, medium-term, sort of big,
Impact
long-term
assessment, benefits.
So, what is the role of regulation and the state, if you want, in this space, in order to fundamentally change the situation of these relationships, which again go beyond the problem of taxation?
Question first for me, first for him.
Here it says that you're supposed to go first, but you
I
just spoke, so
have
I'm
no
not-
doubt. I have no doubt is about interoperability and data portability, because there is enough in the market to be absorbed if only it could be accessed.
Okay.
And the only one to enable that is the users.
Okay, so why don't we have Evgeny's view, and then I'll come back to you on the data portability.
Well, I'm more than happy to apply regulation. It's just that it has to be informed. I'll be very specific. But the regulation I would like to be applied should be informed to the maximum by what I would call institutional imagination, which means that once we regulate and when we regulate, we have to be able to come up or imagine alternative institutions which can go beyond the current status quo, and not just to ensure that the players inside the status quo distribute their revenues and profits amongst each other in the most efficient manner. And I would tell you why I would like to have that criterion, because I think that the conditions of possibility that have made representative democracy and welfare state possible are extremely fragile. And the whole thing can fall apart in 10 years. So if we are thinking that we're in 1960s and there will be a Keynesian welfare state working for another 3 decades, and we have the luxury to just have the institutions we have and not bother about imagining new ones, I don't think we have that luxury. Now, if we think that we need new institutions, then the right to monetize, to me, is somewhat problematic, and as many other similar regulations, in that it freezes the current institutional setup, and it assumes that it's okay for Google to be running everything they're running, from search to artificial intelligence to whatever else they do, mobility to book scanning, and it's okay for Apple to be doing whatever they're doing. All we need to do is just citizens and users, in this case consumers, get a cut. And I'm just not that the equilibrium we have achieved 10 years ago with these companies backed by giant funders like SoftBank and sovereign wealth funds, grabbing whatever share of the market they could grab, is a meaningful or even a just equilibrium or status quo. What I would like to do is for us to really sit down and think, is there a better way for the British Library, for example, to be engaged in the service of offering search to people who are in London? It's not obvious to me that that question has been answered correctly just because a bunch of people with money moved in, destroyed all the competition, and ensured that there is one company that stays on top, which is the fate of Uber and Lyft, backed up by giant funds, being able to lose $4, $3, $5 billion a year. Like, where's genuine innovation there? It's all about who has deeper pockets. So my problem with trying to think about regulation before applying a healthy dose of imagination to the process is that we just risk taking a very conservative approach and just reshuffling the decks a little bit and more or less saying that, fine, guys, you need to pay a small cut. You'll pay that cut to the users. Users maybe will be able to use that money to pay for some of the services they receive from the increasingly privatized welfare state. So you will channel that money back to Google and Apple, who will be running your healthcare system. And well, the rest is fine. And I just don't think that the rest is fine. And I think that we need to imagine what those alternative institutions would be. And why wouldn't be? We have the data, we have the infrastructure, we have everything in place, we have the sensors, we have AI. Once you actually start putting those modules and ingredients together, you come up with very powerful institutions. Far powerful than libraries, far powerful than universities, far more powerful than post office, any of the other non-market institutions we have set up until now. And this is what regulation should do. In the short term, it should encourage the search and the testing of those institutions and see which of them stick, which of them can work better, and then make sure that they channel more money to make sure that they become sustainable.
But we have some problems with the implementation of this ideal situation, considering that we lack few things in Europe. We don't have the capital. We have
tons of pension funds with tons of money. That money is not invested anywhere.
But
So
you talked about deep
for
pockets. You talked about deep pockets holders, and they're not Europeans,
Have you looked
unfortunately.
at Finnish pension fund?
But they're not spent on this.
Well,
so
but they can be spent.
They
on the
could.
purpose.
They could.
Anyway,
I'm just saying we don't have as deep pockets and as other regions of the world. We have.
I think what he's saying is when we want to go to war, we find the money.
We have
so make this a
much
priority.
less talents. Less because we start educating on the disciplines that are needed for the connected society much later in the school age. That's another big problem we have. But we have something that they don't have, and we tend to forget. We are, and we have, the largest consumer market in the world. This is our strength. This is what we should be building on. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the capital. We have the innovation. We have the people. And the responsibility within the public policy side and with how it should be cooperating with the entrepreneurs in Europe and maybe even in other regions of the world. We are the target market for these regions of the world to build their next big wave of innovation. So AI, everybody talks about AI, what it is. I mean, at the end, it's only just a bunch of data put in a machine and having a machine learning running a little bit faster. No, it's a much more sophisticated thing. But the 500 million people beefing those algorithms, it's us. We have this as an asset. And it's like if everybody forgets about it. We are producing that wealth every day.
So coming back to the question, because there is a bit of this, again, short term, middle term, and
The
long term.
regulation should go
What are,
on
I mean,
that
if you
angle.
could actually, let's just take the short term now. If you had the power to influence key regulations today that could at least set the landscape to be more fertile and, again, raise awareness for the kind of bigger changes that you think should happen, what would these regulations be? I mean, Evgeny, let me just start with you because you didn't name one regulation. You're talking about fundamental new types of relationships, new types of structures, having the imagination like we did with the Postal Service or with public libraries in this space.
Well, let's commission, give me some money, I'll tell you exactly how to spend it. I mean, to me, that's a regulation. Isn't that a regulation? We set up a fund, and that fund will just experiment on making sure.
That's an investment.
Yeah, but there needs to be a law, no?
Pedantic about the difference, but there is Margaret Vestager, for example, thinking inside the European Commission about particular regulations. What would you tell her to do? Because
I'm
it's
not a big
her
fan.
Okay.
I don't expect much good to come out of her.
What would you do as competition commissioner?
I would
of the
resign.
European- Yeah, but
That's
one
an
could-
office that should be
but,
abolished.
Evgeny, one could
That's the
argue
enemy.
that you're copping out because you just are seeing like the enemy, the us versus them, and so it's very easy
It's a
to
power
sit
struggle,
here
yes,
as a
sure.
philosopher and to talk about the big, which I
I'll
agree
do arm
with.
struggle next.
Arm struggle? Tweet that. Okay, so there's no concrete regulation that you think could be really useful, as limited as it may be.
No,
in
but we
terms
can.
of-
I'm more than happy tomorrow to pass a law that would prohibit every single British public body to contract with Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and the rest of them. Let's do it. I'll do it tomorrow. But to me, it's a start because without doing that, you'll never build the system I want
So
to
the
build.
opposite is happening, of course, because the NHS, as I think of last week, is now open to business with Trump's visit.
But the problem, but that's the easy part. You know how to block them. Of course, trade complicates things. You'll be immediately taken to, dispute resolution tribunals. You'll be taken to trade courts. WTO will go after you. All of that creates complications. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but that's relatively the easy part. The hard part is what are you going to do next? And how you're going to go about identifying which projects to focus on, where to put the money, and how to bring these different modules together. I mean, to me, that's the hard part. The easiest part, how to block them. I don't want to spend a lot of my time as a philosopher thinking about how I can present a more humane version of Google or Facebook. Not my job.
Okay. And what do you think, what would you tell Margaret Vestager?
I did it already. I go for a much more concrete bottom-up approach. It's about collective action, not class actions, collective actions. So first is about mobilization of people understanding they intrinsically carry value, not of their data, themselves first. Second, that unless we are collectively moving together into the same direction, it's meaningless because we need to create the collective bargaining power. So within the European state, we do have intermediaries that are representing collectively stakeholders. We do have in the copyright levies world, we do have in other sectors. So ideally, what we are asking the European Commission to do, we're asking the commissioners to consider and the Parliament to consider the new one, is to first implement a policy that entitles every resident in Europe to actually get a cashback of 20% of every profit made by every platform that has more than 100 million users in Europe, first. Second, to make that number transparently be notified to the government for the calculation of the corporate taxation of those companies in Europe. Third, to open up the transferability of data initiated by the user if it wants directly from a technology standpoint that can be done. So we need to implement protocols, communication protocols that allows one application to transfer the data into another one, whether it's big or small, it doesn't matter. So if you are clicking your searches on Google, but another search engine needs those data, you as a user, you're able to transfer the data and the queries that you've done on Google into the other. And that would create a significant impact on the Google ability to be the only one place to go for advertisers, because there would be more in the marketplace able to compete. And that would apply exactly the same way for every other service that exists, not just the search engine, not just the social networks. We are also proposing to create national intermediaries that would be representing collectively the digital identities that you would need to represent to have a bargaining power, so that you would be able essentially to have in one country that has roughly 60 million citizens, at least two to compete, between the two themselves, but then be able to federate the interest of their members to negotiate with the other side a fair compensation. And we think that it's very, very significantly linked to how the capital flows and how the next cycle of innovation is going to be funded. And because Europe doesn't have that money and doesn't have a reason, because the government don't believe that they need to put together a sovereign fund. Each one has, Finland has, Norway has it, UK has it, Netherlands has it, but there's not one European one. The only way to do it is to collide the resulting right to monetize income that each one individual in Europe could
So the
collide together.
monetizing income bit, which is what you talked about in the beginning, I think we sort of had that interchange. When you said it's that this other first point, which is that the companies actually not only have the data, they actually know, if you want, are deep inside. That kind of reminds me of Shoshana Zuboff's new book, where she talks about the behavioral surplus. They kind of know what you're going to do even before you do it.
Absolutely.
And she says, you're not searching Google for free, Google is searching you for free. So it seems to me that the fundamental, in some ways, distinction of what you both are talking about is that you're saying in the short term, this is really bad, we have to wake up the citizen, they have to be much more aware of how the data is being used, they should also get a share of the profits, and also we should allow states to recoup a share of the profits being earned by the companies, which this process would illuminate the numbers. And you're talking about the, in some ways, Shoshana's point, which is we have to fundamentally disrupt the way that these relationships are working, that in order to actually, we should think of data completely different. New types of collaboration, new types of knowledge, governance systems between citizens, and fundamentally also worrying even about how the state currently is interacting with that process. You have recently written a critique of Shoshana's book in this concept of behavioral surplus. If you can maybe come back to some of your own thinking in that area.
It's quite long,
of
but
what's
I
inside
can
our bodies.
I can maybe relate what I said of Shoshana and kind of related to what Isabella has been saying, because I think to some extent
this is a book, by the way, called Surveillance Capitalism, which is being talked about around the world.
there is a similar, I don't think it's a major problem, but I think it's a problem definitely in Shoshana's approach and to some extent in what we've heard this evening. There is this tendency, for reasons that are not clear to me, to present the user as the only or the dominant source of value for those firms. And it's not at all to me clear that that's the case, because the data that they derive and draw comes from many different sources which do not default to the user. Some of the data, as you would well know, comes from the public sector. Some of the data, if you look at Google, the reason why Google is so profitable is not because they have a genius way of selling advertising, it's because they pay absolutely zero for indexing the content from third-party sites. If Google would now have to pay UCL, let's say $50 for indexing the content on UCL's website and making it visible to Google's users, Google will go out of business because their cost will go up dramatically. In this case, there is no user, but there is clearly quite a lot of nefarious, some might say, stuff going on. This is where, if you really want to enact the right to monetize, you should just abandon the search and give people basic income. Because how else are you going to determine whether that data comes from the user or it comes from me having a thought and language and expressing it in the city and Google capturing it without me ever knowing that Google was there and never using it, and then using the grammar of the language to structure its machine learning when it comes to natural language processing? If you think that you're going to go down the path of identifying how much value I have created to Google to create that little piece of knowledge when it comes to grammar and linguistics, you'll need to enact a surveillance infrastructure that will be much greater than that of Google. And I don't think that blockchain will save us here. Right? So here, it's just not obvious to me, like universal basic income, to some extent, like I'm a fan, provided other things will be in place. Like on its own, I'm not a fan, but provided other things will be in place, why do I need the right to monetize? Like if it's going to redistribute value that's unjustly captured from me, and it's not captured only in the interface and relationship of the user and the firm, why not just redistribute it among all the parties involved? Why just focus on the user? Right? And that's the problem that I had with Shoshana, because Shoshana does not make the argument about monetization, she's quite opposed to it. But she nonetheless presents the user as the center of this universe, where stuff happens, and it's not obvious to me that the user is the center of that universe.
No, but I need to make a point here that for us, the user is not the consumer. The user is the user. And when you made the point as, what if the user is a public sector, or what if the user is an enterprise? It's a user. Now, I don't know how many of you have spent time on reading Microsoft privacy policies and terms of use on Windows. Have you ever done it? Yes. Did you realize that they are not so different from those of Google and Facebook? So, but you're one in the room, all right? So how many enterprises in the world uses Windows and Office and Outlook and Office 365? It's 90% of the enterprises in the world use the application from Microsoft. And I'm not even talking about Skype, LinkedIn, and the other things that Microsoft acquired in last years. So right to monetize is not about the calculation of the value that that particular entity, whether it's a person or an enterprise or an entity of the public sector, has generated for a particular service provider, is the contribution to the innovation. So it does not, let me go into that. It does not refer to whether the service is for free or is a freemium. under a subscription model. It's the interaction that that particular entity as a user has created back within a particular application. So in the case of Google, it would be, I've helped you to improve your ranking system, and I'm a user of a free service of a search engine. But if I'm an employee of the company and I'm using Windows and I'm using Office 365, which is a subscription my employer is paying for me to use, but I'm using it. I'm paid for using it
for the company. I'm not paid for using it for Microsoft to release its next version. That's why we call right to monetize a contribution to innovation. It's not about paying data, and it's not about paying me for the hours I've been on Microsoft Office. It's on me helping them to lift up the product and go beyond.
There are many types that are not captured by this direct relationship between you and whoever you are and the company that
but
serves
you're
you
always
via
identified as a digital account. So there is
of
always.
course, I walk down the street. I don't identify myself as anything. I improve the services of thousands of firms that are just there gathering data, studying my gait, studying my face.
No, but they're doing it. They're doing it because they trace you digitally, not because they're just taking you by picture. They correlate back in their databases where you've been found elsewhere, so that they can recognize it's you. And the process and the automation is so incredibly fast and incredibly efficient that they are able to calibrate that it's exactly you and not someone like you. We are at the point where it's you.
Before we go to the third, because
So-
we're only going to have 8 minutes on the third question, which is about the international landscape, especially around China. Would the innovations that you're thinking about in terms of right to monetize, but also some of the other interactions you've been having with the European Union and these regulations that you mentioned before, do you think they would actually bring Google out of business? I mean, how much, this example he just gave about UCL.
Incentives never takes anyone out of business.
Because you've done some modeling around this in terms of, how much you actually think that even the right to monetization would reduce the profits of these companies in terms of, if you want, sharing these rewards in a different way. And regardless of the fact if this is incremental change or a radical change, what does it actually do to the business model of the companies and the sort of monopolistic power they currently have? Like, have you looked at it? Is this just a drop in the ocean, or would it fundamentally disrupt?
Disclose too much of the empirical studies that we are trying to carry to try to model it in a way that it's very consistent and not just projected to be very theoretical. But in terms of movement of financial amounts, we are seeing our right to monetize introduction in Europe would move around between 3 and 5 points of GDP for Europe. So we're thinking of a lot of money. And that would not just be a cost for these companies, there would be benefits for them. So they would probably, these companies and other companies would grow. The benefit, it's not just about getting the cut, is having the cut reinjected in the economy. We need to have that fresh money to come in our Europe region to rebuild the welfare state. We can't do it without the participation of citizens.
I choose austerity.
Anyway, okay.
So it's big numbers. We are not sure about yet because, of course, it's extremely difficult to see and to measure it. And we've looked up just at the consumer space. So if we add to that the enterprise space and the smart city, smart environment, it can even be skyrocketing.
You choose austerity because you don't trust the state's
I
ability
think
to
if that's the
attract in
case,
this
where the
space.
solution is worse than the problem. I'm sorry, I've tried to articulate it.
Okay, so we have 6 minutes left before we open up to the audience. So China, what are the implications of what we've talked about for the kind of geopolitics of the digital landscape, given also what's in the news these days?
I think, to some extent, Europe has two options in front of it, given the rise of China. It can help to play the card that we've heard, that it's the largest consumer market, and it's also one of the largest enterprise markets, that it can essentially play the Chinese off the Americans and try to hold the best deal somewhere. So you'll say, fine, you don't want Amazon cloud, we'll get Alibaba cloud, and hope that maybe you'll actually get it cheaper. I think it's a suicidal card to play. I just don't think that you would like to actually commit, I don't know, they'll call it harakiri or something else. I don't think that you would like to do it in public and basically say that we are going to abandon any efforts to have our own infrastructure for cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and potentially the back end and maybe the front end of our welfare state, which is going to rely on these two giant
players competing with each other and offering us the best. And by the way, when you said that, in Europe we don't have those funds related to states that can finance things, right? Aggregated. Well, the reason why it has not happened, I'm sorry to say, has to do with your favorite commissioner, because ultimately that would surely be reinterpreted as state aid. Having an actual state fund that would have a connection to the government has been frowned upon for 20-something years.
Not if it creates additionality and you can prove that it's transforming landscapes.
Yes,
and
I'm just saying that the reason why it hasn't happened.
That's the Corbynite line.
Now it's a different reason. I'm afraid.
But the reason why it hasn't happened is because there has been an active effort to dismantle any effort even to think about industrial
Yes, but
policy.
it has nothing to do with
Including
the
in
commissioners.
Germany.
It's the politicians. It's because the
Sure.
member states didn't want it because they don't want to share funds
Well,
and share
some member
projects.
states do want
And
it now,
a
actually.
project like Galileo was one of the most disastrous ever adventure the Europeans went on because there was a dispute between the continental states and the British as whether or not the Galileo constellation needed or not have a military payload on top of the civilian payload. And then they spent like 20 years talking about shall we fund it or not, shall we fund it or not, shall we fund it or not, until the geolocation wasn't needed anymore because the Americans had their number 2025 for GPS and the Russians had theirs and the Chinese had theirs. And we talk in Europe, we don't do.
Fine,
And
but I
that's
will
the
tell you,
problem.
we do a lot of things to tie people's hands. So if tomorrow I would like to start a sovereign wealth fund like Temasek in Singapore or CIC in China, it would never fly in any European country. It would not fly for the sole reason that for it to make sense and to have some kind of strategic purpose, you would need to have a communication back channel with the state. And it
Yes,
just would
but
not
it's
fly.
state we
Why?
don't want
Because
to do it.
rules have been created to tie the hands of people who would like to build. I'm not advocating Brexit here, but I'm just saying that there are certain structural constraints why it hasn't happened.
There are
It has not
structural
happened. It
constraints.
did not happen because we are ignorant. We don't know that such funds exist. They're just structurally almost impossible to pull off. And until we change those structural conditions, we will not pull them off. So all we'll be left with is to playing the consumer card. But the reason why we are left just with the consumer card is a historical occurrence. It's highly contingent and it can be reversed.
That is absolutely the consumer play that is played by the European in Brussels is a different thing from what we advocated about user engagement. Don't take us wrong. The American companies, the Chinese companies have been very successful in lowering the barrier of usage of technology to the point where the users, people in the world uses technology and love it because it's so easy, so beautiful, so engaging, they don't have to think. Our mistake is to think that we have to follow the same road. No, we want people to think. We want people to elevate their knowledge, and then we're going to be able to make it different. We can't make it just by replacing people's knowledge. We can't.
Look, we're going to bring in the audience now, and I especially would love if some people here that are coming from also different countries. I know we have both Singapore and Estonia over there, who've obviously interacted with, and Italy and Barcelona, and 2 Italians here. No, sorry. So let's see a show of hands, and I think we'll take 3 at a time. So 1 here, 2, a woman somewhere. Francesca.
Me immediately. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah. Well, they gave it to me. Thank you.
And
I
then
actually
here,
have
and
a.
then
Make the
there.
disclosure.
Yeah, disclosure, she's married to this guy.
This. Hello. Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
you can ask Isabella, you have to be
So
quiet.
Isabella, I have like a very short question. I would like to know how you reconcile your idea of the right to monetize, that for me is very close to the idea of data as money, with the fundamentally different framework that we have in Europe, where we consider data and the right to privacy and the right to data protection as a fundamental human right. I mean, I think my problem with this approach of demonetization of personal data that you're advocating is basically that on the short term, that can look like something that it's better off because we kind of get some rewards for the user and so on. But in the long term, this can be really a fundamental problem, in particular where we have a regulation that should forbid what you're saying. I mean, this is actually should be illegal in Europe.
You would be surprised if I tell you that I'm working with Giovanni Buttarelli and we are one of the applications that is pushing harder to get in the market because this is what we do. Look at what we do. We don't ask money. We don't ask, we will never ask, and we don't push for that.
Exactly understand, because I work in I'm working on similar things that is about licensing and control and granular control over how people exchange data.
But this is not about control of data. This is about putting a gateway on consent.
Well, but
stop.
why do you call it right to monetize? I mean, consent is a fundamental right that I have,
Yes.
given the regulation of Europe and given the fact that we have a
Yes.
fundamental human rights chart that is actually very different from any right to monetize. So data is not money in the
I'm telling
European
you why.
framework.
I'm telling you why.
Why?
Because in Europe we have done a very big mistake. We have said that GDPR is only for personal data. Right to monetize is every data. You know about metadata?
Yes,
You
yes.
know e-privacy. E-privacy doesn't get approved because there is no framework for that, because the Europeans are so happy with their GDPR framework, they have forgotten that 80% of the value of the market is on metadata. And we have to cover that up. We have to find a new policy for that. So unless we wake up people's knowledge on how they can be powerful on denying consent, right to monetize is not about in itself the monetization. It's the right to say no.
Next
I think
question.
that anyway,
Okay, we
it
can come
requires
back to
some,
this,
because
yeah.
you talk about then assessing the value of this and the monetary value of this. So obviously this is not just consent. But anyways.
So I have a question regarding the the deposit. So who owns? Who is in charge of the data in your? Because if it's a public body,
Yes.
Traditionally some public bodies have been very reluctant to provide data that is useful to citizens. So,
Right.
for example, let's say we want the data about the all the buildings that are
Okay.
that can burn down, all the towers that can burn down, right?
Yes.
All kinds of data that
Sure.
are useful to citizens that the governments generally try not to provide. So how would you, what type of mechanisms would you have to ensure that the data is accessible?
Mm-hmm.
Let's get two questions, and then we'll take another two, so you can answer two at a time.
Three quick comments. First is, to me, the problem is actually having to use smartphones for everything. I don't carry around a smartphone. The number of times I read something, you travel by train or by reservation, we do it by smartphone, we do need everything, which slightly concerns me. There's probably something you mentioned again, it's fine, but a little bit oppressive, and the trouble is you say we will regulate data or whatever. What's to stop me using a VPN and saying, yes, if I don't like the European regulations, I will go on an American website or whatever. And the last one, this is probably totally pie in the sky. Are we not based too much around the advertising model? I think about Channel 4. The trouble with Channel 4, all the programmes seem to be geared towards young people. Why? Because the advertiser will pay 5 times as much for the text as young people and older people, so I understand. I'm not the expert. And the danger is you're actually ending up with a, if you like, with a web that's geared around younger people, really geared around people who want to watch advertising, and they're worth far more to users. And therefore that could mean that certain people are being, being shut out or sort of valued less.
Okay, why don't you respond to these two, and then if you want to add anything.
Sure. Well, that's 4 now because there were 3 questions, so I will not respond to all of them. So on the question of data that's sometimes made inaccessible by public institutions, I mean it's correct in general, but it's also inaccessible very often in private institutions for very good reasons. So I wouldn't necessarily draw a comparison between the two to imply anything. Sure. But in the public sector, I think you can actually have not the requirements, but mandates to release that data, and I think they should be enforced. The question that, for example, the open data movement has faced, the problem that open movement has faced in the last decade was that a lot of the data has been released without thinking very hard about who's going to be using it. So a lot of the entities that were actually using it were entities like hedge funds that needed that data to optimize something in their model, so to identify some profitable opportunities. So a lot of the data related to geolocation, where cars are moving, and so forth, instead of benefiting the activists or the citizen entrepreneurs, benefited mostly actually disproportionately large financial players, right? And that was not probably the intended
goal of the regulation, in which case we then have to maybe even think beyond just the open licenses and think of ways in which we can encourage certain parts of society, whether they are non-profits or I don't know, individuals or universities, to have easier access to it, perhaps for free, than anybody else. Because otherwise, people with the best machine learning algorithms, people with the best infrastructure, who typically happen to be companies, will just take much greater advantage of that data. Right, but on the basics, I think mandates to disclose is the way to go. I just don't see any other way to do it. I mean, then of course you can go about finding ways in which citizens can indicate which data sets might be available but are not shared by their authority and so forth. But those, I think, are details. There should be some kind of a discovery mechanism. As for some of the questions we've heard, if I understood the question addressed to me specifically correctly, you were concerned that some of the measures I've proposed might enable some kind of authoritarian government outreach where you will not be able to use a VPN to access some of the...
What I'm saying is, if you have too much regulation, then the temptation to say, we're going to regulate Google. That's fine. I mean, I can always use Alta-Vista or something else at the moment.
Yes.
If you're saying, you were going to limit Google searches to 50% or whatever, therefore, switch off after a while. So, yeah, well, you can do that. I'm simply going to log on as an overseas user, and therefore, anything other than national body regulating, which is probably unfeasible, is not really going to be effective.
Sure. Well, I don't think I've advocated shutting down access to Google, even though, I wouldn't necessarily discourage anybody from pursuing that option either, but making it harder for them to sell enterprise solutions to governments and public institutions, that's something that concerns me much more than what happens in the individual consumer level. I think at this point, it's probably, it's almost too late for Europe to be solving it at the consumer end. There are still things to be done, but at this point, the actual welfare resides in those enterprise solutions that they're selling. This is where I think we have to be much more careful.
Okay, I'm going to give Isabella just a chance to say one more thing to Francesca that she's asked me to, and then we have two more questions. One, the woman in the back. Can I see some other hands? Yep, and then here. And Simone as well? Yep. So Isabella.
So a point I want to make very clear about how right to monetize and earning app ties together and why it came in the market now. It's that because before the GDPR entered into force and we started working on the project, we made an analysis in the market and we've seen what actually it was quite evident for everybody, that there are a group of companies that applies the rules and other group of companies that applies it less because they build on the advantage of it's been a wild west for a long time. And privacy in digital has been the wild west for a long time until GDPR entered into force. Now, there is an article in GDPR that says, Article 7, that says that the user has a right to say yes, no, delete, and export its data. These are 4 functions that have been put in the provision and that have not been technically implemented with any standards in Europe. Now, usually in Europe, when we adopt regulation in Europe, then we are fond of standards because we like saying now there is a scheme for the industry to abide to and to live with. But it was not done for GDPR. So what we discovered is that every company, that is the Google, the Facebook, the Uber, the WhatsApp, or the others of this world, very differently from the verticals that are transformed in a digital way their relationship with the consumer and the user and the client, but have been running, if you want, more traditional businesses and have been abiding by the previous regulation in Europe that was the other directive regulating data protection back in 1995. They were always the traditional companies bound by, I get the consent, I store the consent, I show the consent, I'm compliant, and I get fined if I am not compliant, while everybody else was not. So what we said to the authorities and what we said to the industry and what we said to the standards bodies with why no one standardizes in digital privacy settings. Why in this world today, users are empowered by saying, I opt out. I don't want to be tracked. I don't want to be targeted by advertisement. I don't want to this. I don't want to be that because it's written in GDPR. But there's no implementation. Absolutely. So we designed an app that allows people to opt out systematically, immediately. Whenever Google has taken the yes, you say no. And it's beautiful because people opt out. Great. They don't need to be paid. They opt out. That's the first step. Because I talked about awareness. Yeah. We need the awareness. Now, what happens? GDPR is just half of the market. It's 25% of the market. It's personal data. It's all the other data. So when we talk about contribution to innovation, think about the data that are non-personal, but that are lost in the space of where this data, who has responsibility for managing this data? The public sector? Maybe. The private sector? Sometimes. The user, the consumer? There is no coordination. There is no collective policy on how do we optimize the usage of data, unless we find a way for the end user, who is also the generator of the data, to understand what is his incentive to give it more to the state, or to give it more to the private sector, or to not give it to any of the two, because he has at least the right to choose. That's the only thing that right to monetize says, the right to choose, period. But if it is for a use that is commercial, and it's not a personal data, then there must be a monetization scheme that allows the cash back for the user, which is also the public sector. It can be the public sector to earn back and reinvest. And then it's a cycle of incentives.
Okay, question in the back there?
Yep. Well, thank you. I'll try to be brief, but I've got a couple of comments. I'll just put forward those that I think they're linked one to each other, so you can pick which one you want to answer to. So I do agree that when we talk about personal data, we do have to make a number of premises, and to kind of think about monetizing them, it's a little bit tricky. So we might want to discuss about, limits, put some limits to some business models when it's about personal data. I don't think it's out of this discussion, and I don't think it runs against innovation. But that's another story. So let's think about the equation that for innovation companies, they need my data, right? Our data. I tend to agree, but I'm not that confident in using innovation in such an unusual way, or just assuming that every kind of innovation is good innovation for society. So companies, they need our data also for bad innovation, or they also need our data for innovation that I don't take any profit out of it in an individual level, societal level. So why should I think that I need to contribute to that? Or why do I think that innovation should be always a positive thing? Sometimes I believe that this is not the case, and I think that if we get kind of a fair share of this innovation, we might run the risk to create inequalities in society, because people, they don't need to monetize their data. They probably won't but they won't give their data for innovation they don't believe in. While people that they need money, they will do that. And this is a fact. It's not good or bad. I think it's a fact, something that will happen in society. Now, the second thing is, I wonder if any of those discussions that we have had today would be different if, rather than having 4 or 5 big players in the market, we would have like hundreds of smaller players that actually compete with each other. And when I say compete, I tend to refer to a technical, common understanding of competition. So the competition should aim at, improving quality, choice, innovation, and so on and so forth. I do believe that every time we spoke, I think Isabella spoke about it mostly, about users being locked in. This is also because we are users having choices. This is because we don't have alternatives, but we can create those alternatives. Now, thinking about competition.
Sorry, there's quite a few other questions, so if you can just frame it.
Yeah. The last one is one of this is a very UK-based argument. So I've heard the House of Lords report has suggested that for mergers in data-driven mergers, for example, which is something we're talking about here, we should have a public interest test in assessing those mergers. So out of all this discussion we had today, which would be the public interest test you would suggest for those mergers?
Good. Thank you. Then we had, sorry, did I point to before? Oscar? Yeah, I think I had pointed to you too. And then we also, why don't we just take quite a few, but please be brief in your questions so we can actually have time to answer them all.
I'd like to ask about this value that is monetizable. The data, because why is it valuable? It's because there's a lot of corporation that is willing to sell or purchase commercials on these platforms. So it's really much of this innovation is about targeting commercials more specifically than was possible earlier. And is this commercial industry that's just growing larger because of these new possibilities, is this really value creating? Hyman Minsky used to classify this part of the firm as the overhead that is not used for the production of the products that we're purchasing. So that cost will be internalized into into the cost in the market of the products we buy. So although we provide our data for free, we're still paying for the services that we get through the costs that are internalized in the products. So I'm trying to think macroeconomically about this. And furthermore, we're paying through the cost in the market, but we're also letting corporations deduct their costs from their corporate taxation. So maybe we should think about how to shrink this market. Maybe this whole sector should just be deflated. What do you think about that?
Okay. One more. On this side, there was someone. Was it? Simon?
Yeah, sorry for bringing you back to the question of ownership of data and perhaps companies, because it's interesting to see the parallel between now and what happened after the second industrial revolution with the emergence of monopolies and large cartels. The way in which they dealt with them at that period was through splitting them up, or through public and then regulate them, or through public ownership. And the most powerful of those cartels and monopolies was the oil cartel, with Standard Oil, which was split up in the US, the Rockefeller into Exxon, Mobil, and so on. And then in the international level, there was an emergence of state-owned oil companies, and all the Middle East state-owned oil companies. So the question would be, is it possible to apply the same solutions to these new seven sisters, big tech seven sisters? And if yes, how? Or if not, why?
Okay, so public value interest tests and issues around kind of the quantity theory of competition, whether we should just shrink the market, and this question of ownership and cartels. You can.
I can pick up on the bad innovation versus good innovation. There's always bad and there's always good. Innovation is about risks, and you need to have people investing in that risk, and we need to participate in that risk. So we're not saying that the innovation has to be good. I mean, innovation is about taking the risk that actually you end up with innovation cycle and you discover that it was not good at all, and there's a price for that. But if the intent is to help the innovation cycle, and the data are so fundamental to help that cycle, I think we all have a collective responsibility in making more data available. Then whether this data should all only go into certain places, that's the whole wrong point of the whole story. That's why we advocate for interoperability and portability, which are two different concepts, distinct concepts. Because the moment you create the transferability of data, raw data, we're not talking about the post-process data, the raw data, you create immense more opportunities for new players to play in. There are examples. I mean, probably you've heard about a company called Here. It used to be called Namtech in the past. It was owned by Nokia, and they were doing mappings. And they're now developing this very great technology stack that is open source for geolocation, geofencing, geodata, three-dimensional. I mean, they are really building a very significant effort in that space to be the contender to Google Maps. The contender to Google again. Now, we've made an inquiry, market surveys with people around Europe, and we asked to a significant amount of people how many of them knew that Waze is owned by Google. Less than 1%. So everybody thinks that they stop the geolocation on maps, and they're not giving away their data on geolocation to Google because they stopped the GPS to connect to the map application. Because Google has decided that when it acquires companies, Waze used to be an Israeli company they acquired, they don't change anymore the name because the people so they cannot connect it that it's a Google service. But the reality is that Waze is one of those applications that doesn't allow you to opt out. You can't get out of Waze. If you use Waze, you have to give the data to Waze. If you use Maps, you can opt out. Now, can you tell me why? Because the companies, they want to control how they get the data. They don't want the people to know how to get out of that. And because some innovation is well and some innovation is bad, because they need millions of data. And this is the power of actually that resides in the people. So there is no bad and good innovation. There is a risk that everybody has to take, but there's the only way to
guide it through is to participate in that, if I can answer that question in that way.
The ownership question around.
No, I'm not even sure I agree with what we've just heard. I mean, Facebook
Better.
clearly has a very successful innovation cycle. Clearly, data plays a very strong role in it, but the end result of it is we end up as zombies at the end of it. So, yeah, there is no good and bad innovation, but in this case, I'm not sure we would like that outcome. Right, so I just don't know why we have such a hard time responding to the question that the gentleman asked us about whether we are actually just adding more fuel to the advertising industry, which is interested in just automating our every action to extract more data and to make us more addicted to clicking.
But the point on
it can be
innovation
super
was different.
innovative, like all these firms are prospering, so clearly the market task has been met.
No, but I think that the question from that part of the room was different, because it was why someone would be happy to fund with its own data an innovation that is a poor innovation because it's on a bad application of the data that it gathers from me. So I would not be happy to be paid back through the right to monetize if my data would be used to fund a bad product, for example, or a poor product or a poor application. I think that was the question.
Is it the market task or is it the...
No, the point is that when you
that?
give away your raw data, you don't know what the post-processing is going to be. You don't know what the cycle is going to be of those data, right? So if you want to be supplying your data in a way that is the way it's happening today, I mean, we're not talking about a different way, this is why it's happening. Companies take this data and build things that you may like or not. You have no control on what they do, and then you're just happy to use what the resulting application of the data is. But also the other thing that is relevant to say is that the cycle of innovation is going into the direction of fewer, higher quality data is better than just big data, because machine learning works with lots of data, but the reality is that if the data are pre-filtered and are already of a higher quality, it works a lot better. So there is an effect, a positive effect also on those who are the processors of the data, to try to find a better way to collect the data and to correlate the data in a different way. And again, we are of the opinion that if there is an action, that there is an engagement that is driven by the user, that he understands why he's qualifying the data for a particular recipient, and he has a benefit out of that, like for example, if he gets certain public services improved because he's giving away this data in a way that is more conscious, that could be beneficial. Because he understands.
Through a concrete example, which I'll give you, because it seems to me that the idea of calling it data monetization already assumes that the test of success is how successfully you monetize it, which means that the marketplace is the ultimate determiner of success and not any external or internal normative criteria. And let me give an example. So as we use Google, as we use CAPTCHAs, which we have to fill in to prove that we are not a human, clearly we are contributing to Google's ability to recognize objects. Now, after that, do I know whether those services are fed into Waze, into Waymo, into Google's mobility services, or whether they are fed into Pentagon's drone system, which then goes to Yemen and bombs the hell out of it? Do I know? I don't.
But
would you tell me?
I have a question for the room, for the audience. How many of you did know that CAPTCHA is owned by Google? 1, 2, 3.
You have to recognize
4.
the strange letters.
I mean, very few. Still few. Too
Well,
few.
there are tons of CAPTCHAs that are not owned by Google. I don't think it's actually a correct question to ask, because Google, when it shows you CAPTCHA, clearly it owns that CAPTCHA. When Facebook shows you CAPTCHA, it's owned by Facebook. I mean, those are all site-specific CAPTCHAs. In some cases, Google provides it as a service, but I just don't think it's a fair question to ask.
But
my question remains, I mean, when that data feeds an image recognition system, which Google then cross-sells across 10 different services, some of which are in the public sector, but unfortunately they're used to destroy Yemen. Some of them are in the private sector, but we don't know whether it goes to Waze or it goes to Waymo. How does it feed back to the idea of the right to monetize and this contribution in terms of innovation that you told us is the benchmark?
Because you can stop it.
Her point is not just the right to monetize, it's the right to
choose.
Complete transparency.
It's the right to choose. You can say, I'm not giving you this data. I don't know what you do. You don't give me transparency for what you do. I'm not interested in money. I just don't give it. Period. I deny the consent on those data. Now, technically speaking,
does that lead to a shrinkage of the market?
You tag it. And because you tag it, every other usage of that data that has been contrarian to what has been your desirability of usage prevents it. It's like trading on an auction house a stolen good. There are no buyers.
Don't use the
There is.
Just don't use the service.
Well, you know, when you enter into a service, a terms of service agreement, it's written in a way where you go for one reason.
But that's his point, right? Instead of going to Google, you go to the British Library. If it had been investing the resources that it could from, in fact, state-created currency, could actually be creating alternatives. And so
No,
the
but the
question
law is
do we
very
need
clear.
alternative?
It is to be transparent, the purpose for which the data is taken. So they need to become transparent. They like it or not, they need to become transparent. The moment you become transparent, of course, you have less tendency to say yes.
So we have 4 minutes left to answer the last two questions. I mean, shrinkage, you've sort of, but did someone want to say something about the ownership, data, oil, cartels, Rockefeller?
I think it will lead the whole 4 minutes. I'll answer it privately. I think it will lead our whole 4 minutes.
We have to say something about ownership.
I have a very
and he's one of
complex
our
view on
PhDs.
antitrust.
I'm more on rights of use. I'm more on rights of use than ownership. This is not about who owns it, but what are the level of rights of use that you associate with certain data and for certain purposes.
All right, you have literally 10-second question and 10-second answers. So 1, 2, 3, and then we stop. So we have 3 minutes.
Comment and rhetorical question. I'm joining
No comments,
you
just question.
on the addiction and you on the old example. The data seems to be, to me, a commodity at the heart of an addiction. Can you hear me properly, or
Yeah, we
do you need microphone?
Yeah, we
So
have
to me,
video.
the data is sort of equals to being a commodity at the heart of an addiction to cheap services. And we want Facebook without paying, we want Google without paying. At the heart, we're user and consumer that are very used for not paying anything. And it reminds me the fact that we're a world that uses oil for cheap, and how would you fight these addictions? Would it be the fight against ignorance typically? Again, it's rhetorical, but I think it's much broader as a way to find solution than just finding who is the owner or who pays for that.
Woman there on the right.
Even if
And then
French, I will
Thank you. Just to add another complexity to this whole discussion on monetization, what happens with the data that you don't know it's collected about you? So today you need to file access requests to different companies that you probably never heard about before in order to find out they're massively tracking you. How would I be able to monetize that? And how is this monetization even diminishing this phenomenon, which is very pervasive and very damaging to society at large? We have democracies being weakened because of tracking. We have our personal privacy being invaded by these companies. So I don't see how this monetization will actually solve our problems.
Okay, 2 more there, and then we'll just have a free-for-all answers.
Just a concern, it seems like a necessary condition that lots of us as citizens start to engage more, and I just worry because the things we're getting from the system are even more convenient. We have even less time to do all this, and yet we seem to need to do this to make progress in on either proposition.
I just want to say there's been really illuminating discussion, but very depressing as well. And if there was more time, no.
Ours, you just need to conquer.
I'm very much, I think, on your side. If there are sides here, I just think it would be nice to have another discussion. A bit. You hinted early on about the connection between, if I can say this, capitalist innovation and competition. The idea that innovation comes from competition. And I'd like to have time to explore, if we could at some point, the idea of socialized innovation, that it comes from cooperation much more. It doesn't have to come from competition. And what would that look like? How would you support it? How would you enable it better? So it's a completely separate discussion, really. I'm much less interested in finding ways to make the present system, slightly more amenable. I just think and that's why I'm depressed.
So, Evgeny?
Well, to answer your question, I can just point you to a very long 35-page article I just published in New Left Review in the issue that just came out last week, which goes into quite some detail about what that socialized innovation might look like. I'll just use the 30 seconds I have to maybe to respond even to the question on antitrust. I think within the current framework where we really want to break up these firms, it's reasonable. But I've tried to communicate my skepticism about the continued existence and permanence of that system for the long term. I think that the threats that it's facing requires a different method and approach that would just say, as long as we have more competition and we go from 1 Google to 10 Googles, things will get better. They might marginally get better, but they will also get non-marginally worse in many other respects, unless certain things are fixed, right? So for me, as much as I would like to join this round of tech bashing and say that let's break up Google, Facebook, and whatever, I just think that it also distracts to some extent from having a much more serious conversation of what a world where competition is not the only yardstick to determine policy would look like. And unfortunately, all of the antitrust discussions we are having in the US and to some extent in Europe, they assume that competition is the yardstick by which policies should be crafted.
Yeah, if I can pick up on the data that we don't know who takes them and where they end up, it's very simple. Technology allows, if the user is sufficiently awakened and conscious, to express his consent or deny his consent. Technically speaking, it's a log, it's a record. And until these records are stored in the third-party servers, there's no way to get it out to have a confrontational discussion as whether I did say yes or I did say no, because simply it's sitting somewhere else. So what we thought that it would be good is to create a system that certifies that when it's a no, and it's written somewhere else. Because that somewhere else can be accessible to the user, can be accessible to those who are representing the users, and it has to be a reverse proof from the service provider that, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you had said yes, and actually you had said no. And the reality is that when the judges today, they called on the service provider to prove that certain data have been breached or not, the excuse is, oh, I'm sorry, you need to call on my friend in California, you need to call on my friend in this other country, and it takes a little bit of time, and then I don't know if I need to give you the data. So transparency in the denial of consent is one of the values that we're trying to bring on the table because it's part of the Article 7. When I have said no, it's no to be targeted. It's no to be used like a good. And it's a no forever or for as long I decide is a no. So if that power comes in the hand of people, it's on everything. Yes, it's powerful. It's very powerful. And that applies to every single service provider that thinks to work around the rules. So we can take it offline, but there are zillions of companies that we've looked into. We have categorized them. We have ranked them. We're going to be publishing an index of how good or bad they are in implementing those policies that are written well by the European Commission, but are not enforced. And we call for enforcement to actually be certifiable. So we're not going to be certifying ourselves. We're going to be asking the Europeans to find a process and a way for certifying how the Article 7 of GDPR can be enforced.
Great, so we're way over time. So thank you, everybody. We have 2 more events, one on cities and data and one on health. And hopefully we'll talk also about the big debates around the NHS and data. And thank you very much. And there's plenty of wine and other things.